Hey, you can hear me. Good. Welcome all to the next lecture in the Games Now series. After all the panel discussions we've been having lately, it's an honor now today to have guests all the way from Uruguay, Gonzalo Frasca. He's a game scholar and a game designer and has been working, for example, with lots of serious games, and I think today we will be hearing something about some new developments in the like meeting point of education and games. So, welcome.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and really happy for the invitation. I haven't been in Finland in a long time, and way too long. So. Let me tell you a little bit what I'll be talking about today. This is a strange talk in the sense that it's, I usually work both as a designer and as an academic, and this is a more design-oriented talk in the sense that this is something that I've been working probably from the last year on, and I've been discussing a lot with many colleagues that are working on so-called educational game design. And I say so-called because to call a game educational, it's like the less sexy way of referring to anything. The moment you call something educational, there's, I don't know, some sort of reaction that it becomes suspicious. Let me first, First, you know where I'm from, but just in case, Homer Simpson is always there to remind you. And before actually getting into the talk, I usually do a brief overview of a social experiment we're having in Uruguay. Uruguay is a small country, 3.5 million people, so a bit smaller than Finland. And it's sort of a welfare state, or used to be. So. For South America, we're quite special in the sense that we still have somehow free education and free healthcare, and socially we're seen as very progressive, at least for the region. Okay, we were the first country to give a right of vote to women in South America. Second country to be, and only Cuba and Uruguay have an abortion law that was passed last year. We have gay marriage, gay adoption. Now the state is going to produce and sell marijuana. And I'm just telling you this because Uruguay, because it's small, you know how iPhone games get tested in New Zealand? Okay, well, some social experiments are happening in Uruguay. And one of the most impressive ones is the One Laptop Per Child project. You probably heard about it a few years ago. It was introduced about 8 years ago by Nicolas Negroponte. And the only people who were crazy enough to fully adopt it was Uruguay. And it's been going on by almost 7 years now. And basically, 85% of the students in school and high school go to public education. And so the state will buy every single boy and girl a notebook computer and has worked in order to get Wi-Fi in every school and in many public spaces. Right now, 75% of the children have Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi access within 300 meters of their homes. So for South America, that's very, very, very impressive. And in addition to that, our capital city is being wired with fiber optics. So the whole city, in 2 years, will have an internal fiber optic intranet that will allow us to pirate movies with lots of elegance. Did I say that? Are you broadcasting this? No, I'm just kidding. And I always want to start my talks by giving an overview about this because it usually has it doesn't work, or it didn't work the way the bureaucrats sort of expected. I mean, it definitely had zero impact in our PISA testings. We actually went down since last time, and we're pretty bad right now. But the people who run the project, they say, well, I mean, it's not a rich country, so this costs quite a lot of money. And people say, why are you wasting all this money giving computers to kids if the only thing they do is playing video games? And usually their answer is that, well, when people brought electricity to schools, did you test to see if the education improved? And it's sort of an unfair answer in the sense that at the beginning people expected that magically the computer was going to help. And actually it did. I work in a high school in one of the toughest and poorest neighborhoods in Montevideo. That there's a lot of like, in addition to poverty, I mean drug dealing and violence. And one of the interesting things that happened to me is that these kids that go to this high school, I mean it's public, it's private but free. It's not run by the state. But I keep interacting with kids that normally you would think that, I mean, a lot of them have to struggle in order to learn, but about 10% of them, because of the computer and because they had enough motivation and resources, it literally changed their lives. I mean, I was once walking by the high school, and a 12-year-old kid approaches to me and said, "Excuse me, sir, what is your favorite civilization?" And I was like, "What sort of question is that?" And he started telling me about something, the Hittites who ruled Mesopotamia 3,500 years ago. And what did you learn that? And I was at YouTube. Okay. And then a couple of weeks later, there is this girl who approaches me and said, "Sir, you travel a lot, right?" I said, "Have you been to Japan?" "Yes." "Because I speak Japanese." And these are kids who don't have running water. Some of them don't have electricity. They live in houses made of like cardboard and bricks. I was like, "You speak Japanese?" And she started speaking Japanese. And I was like, "How on earth did you do that?" YouTube. She was watching, she got hooked on some anime shows, and she taught herself Japanese. And of course, this is only a minimum amount of the kids, but those kids in those living conditions, they could teach themselves because they have internet access and because they have a free computer. Otherwise, it would have been impossible. But that's probably only 5 to 10% of the kids. I mean, it's definitely not as it was seen by technocrats as a magical solution to educational problems. But it definitely, to some kids, it really brought them to the world. And one of the impacts that that hasn't been measured, but I think is quite significant, is also on a gender level. Because even families where they had a computer, it was culturally seen as a more male thing, and usually the brothers will just spend more time on the computer than the girls. And now that everybody has a computer, it's interesting to see the dynamics and how they get to do whatever they want. And as another social experiment, we're trying to get calves into the internet. No, just kidding. But it's interesting how when they learn how to upload to YouTube, like every kid on the countryside started like videotaping cows. And if you look for Uruguay in YouTube, there's like thousands of videos of cows. That's another unexpected impact of the one laptop per child. Anyway, what I want to talk about education. Mainly, I mean, I'm interested in serious games in general, right? I also been a commercial video game designer for more than a decade, focusing on animation, making video games for Cartoon Network, for Star Wars, for pretty big entertainment franchises for kids and teenagers, mainly in the States and in Hollywood. But in addition to that, I also like to experiment with political games, with also a little bit of outdoor gaming, And recently I've been more and more interested in educational games. Why? Because they're one of the biggest challenges as a designer these days. I mean, I don't know about Finland because everybody wants to have the Finnish school system, except in Finland, because everybody I talked to said, well, we should improve this and this and that. But from the rest of the world, everybody thinks that this is a holy land of education. And that being said, again, video games are trendy, and the global crisis on education means that a lot of adults, without thinking twice, tend to think, okay, well, we'll buy iPads and put video games on kids because kids love video games, and somehow we'll trick them into learning something by playing video games, which of course it's a very lame strategy. I'm not saying that I don't believe games can be powerful teaching tools and learning tools, but it sort of became a second wave of educational fashion, I guess, internationally to believe that educational games are going to change the world. Still, and we're going to see a few examples, there's some excellent stuff going on. And by excellent, I think there's like 5 or 7 really, really, really great examples of educational video games. The rest are awful crap. By crap, I'm using a very technical word, like awful stuff. Mainly by 2 reasons, because of the business model of educational software. The business model of educational software has nothing to do with teaching, but to scare parents, so they buy stuff, and usually parents are afraid that their kids can't count or spell. It's interesting how that's the most scary thing for parents. In the sense that, why is that? Because those are the 2 things that are easy to measure. If you ask a family, what would you like your children to be when they grow up? Oh, I'd like them to be happy and smart and creative. But when the only thing that's easy to measure is spelling, and not even math, arithmetics. So that's 95% of educational software focus on that, and 95% of educational software focus on selling to parents something that, oh, my kid is not smart enough, maybe a game will help him or her. Okay, and the other side of the business model is to sell video games to schools or to governments. And of course, schools and governments don't want, I mean, there's a lot of good intentions, but at the end, it's very easy to fool them with flashy stuff, and they think that we're doing some high-tech stuff, and at the end of the day, they're buying software that is pretty bad. And why is it pretty bad? Again, because the business model of educational software, it's sold as a product and not as a service. Most educational software is not updated constantly, doesn't get a lot of feedback, doesn't iterate much. I mean, once the company's finished version 1.0, they start working on 2.0 with more features. It's a very Microsofty approach to software development, and that has hurt a lot of the potential of using this for learning stuff. So, speaking of which, before we get into what we can learn through games, it's interesting how video games, because of a Darwinian sort of requirement, had to become really good at teaching themselves. Because if you don't learn how effectively and fast how to play a game, you only have a couple of minutes window, and if you can't teach it itself, the player will move on to some other game. Okay, it's like zapping on the TV. So video game designers over the decades have had to invent different techniques, mainly the tutorial, to teach effectively the game. And that's one of the litmus tests to see if a game is very bad. If you see instructions like this on a game, you know the game sucks. Without even, I mean, it works on 95% of the games. If they didn't have the time and resources to work on a decent tutorial, and at the end of the production they just put together some text with some graphics and hope that that will be good enough to to teach, in this case, a web game, you know that the quality probably of the game is not very good. So that's a way of spotting a bad quality game just by looking at the instructions. Anyway, when we talk about educational games, the first thing that comes, I mean, and the usual suspect and usual example is Math Blaster, this series of drilling games where basically, I mean, supposedly Mark Twain said this, but actually I've been doing some research and it wasn't him. But in the same way that golf is a great walk spoiled, well, this sort of drill-based educational games are like a great game spoiled. Basically, it's like a video game, and suddenly every 5 minutes it gets interrupted by math, and it sucks, right? I mean, you're like, oh, imagine like you're watching a movie and suddenly like every 5 minutes, like, oh, 2 + 42. It's like, what's going on? Well, that's a model that's easy to understand also for whoever is buying the software. And that's I've seen also very, very important. In the same way that when you're creating, let's say, an app, what's the most important thing when you create an app? Like, in terms of production? It's not a rhetorical question, but I know the answer. Okay, I'm gonna answer it myself. Okay? The screenshots you're gonna put on the App Store. You have to spend a huge amount of time working on those. Actually, the app comes second. Why? Because those screenshots are the ones that buyers are gonna see. And that's probably the only interaction they will have with the game. Okay? It's even more important than a trailer. I mean, those 2, 3, 4 different screenshots should be able to convey the whole game. The mechanics, the story, the characters, the goal, the objectives, and even if it has flashy technology. It's very challenging to do that. I mean, if you're interested in game design, seriously, you should practice to take great screenshots. That the screenshots are like the movie poster. They have to convey not only mechanics, but also feelings. And in educational software, you have to try to convince how the game is educational. And the funny thing and the problem is that most people, we do have like a folk theory of how education works, and we tend to believe it works in certain ways. And it's very persuasive to tell, usually, a family that, okay, kids love video games, kids don't like math, we're just going to try to hide the mathematics inside a game, and kids will love them. And that's what, actually, it's not James Kidd who said that educational games are chocolate-covered broccoli, but Brenda Laurel. And I made a mistake when I originally said that on the abstract of this talk. It's quite a common mistake, but it was actually Brenda Laurel. Brenda Laurel, one of the very first female programmers in Atari, one of the very first theoreticians in game design. If you haven't read Computers as Theater, that's a classic from 1995, I think. And more importantly, she created a Purple Moon, a short-lived but very interesting video game studio that focused on making video games for teenage girls. And by games by teenage girls, it means no dolls and no Barbies, but actually interesting, I mean, respecting girls as human beings, unlike Barbie. So she went bankrupt, and she wrote a book called Utopian Entrepreneur. That's quite an interesting also reading on the business side of how to make socially aware and educational games for girls. And so, again, this powerful idea of like, you don't like your broccoli, we put some chocolate on it and you're gonna eat it anyway. And that's the approach that educational video games have taken. So, this is a Norwegian game. I don't know if you know it, Dragon Box. Who has played it? Nobody? Oh, you're in for a treat. It's an excellent game. I'm gonna make a critique of this game, and it may seem that I don't like it, but I love it. It's one of the most elegant and powerful educational video games I ever seen in my life. It's one of the few 5 or 6 I really think they're onto something really interesting. This is a French mathematics high school teacher who lives in Norway, and he was fed up that his students didn't like mathematics, and he created a card game in order to teach kids on how to solve equations, and it worked surprisingly well. And then he did an app version. It's called Dragon Box, and it's one of the most elegant tutorials I ever seen. I mean, you should definitely. It's like €4 or €5 on the iPad. It's on every single platform, and it's definitely a must see. So basically, you have these two different areas, and you have these cards, and the tutorial is very elegantly, I don't know, displayed, and it basically teaches you to isolate this box, which is the dragon box, in order to level up. And in order to do that, you have all these other cards and that slowly become numbers. And in order, and you have, every card has its opposite, and if they collide, they become this sort of like a vortex. And slowly, on every level, and every level is actually enjoyable and challenging, you start very slowly moving towards equations, and at the end of the game, after about half an hour, you learn the algorithm to isolate X on equations. And it actually works. I've seen it work with kids that are 6 years old and are supposed not to be able to understand equations until they're 12. It's almost spooky. It's a very smart game. And let me show you the trailer. I'll give you a better idea of what's going on. So you have to isolate that box on the side. There are two versions, one for younger kids and one for older. The one for older kids has more levels. So if you're thinking of buying one, you should buy the plus 12 version. It's actually fun. I mean, not just is effective, but it's also fun. And basically, this is a game based on the concept of the tutorial. The whole game is a single tutorial. Every single level is there for a reason, and its elegance is amazing. However, and this is a big however, and again, I think this game is great. But the tutorial as a cognitive device is a great invention. Basically, it means that we're going to guide you, generally in order to learn a game, but in this case to learn something else. And we're going to give you different chances, which is different levels, and you will never, in order to solve the current level, you have to build upon what you learned on the previous one. And you're never being given information ahead of time that you're not going to use. You're given the exact amount of information at the moment you actually need it. It's a very customized experience, and of course, if you're stuck on a level, you can go back, pay attention to previous levels, and then solve more challenging levels. So in theory, this is the way schools should work, right? Everybody is different, and everybody maybe needs a different amount of time, a different amount of challenges, and this is a very personal approach to learning. And it definitely can be used for many things, and I think Any game designer, even if you're not interested in serious games or in educational games, can learn a lot about this game. Why? Because tutorials, I mean, there's not very good theory, or there's not even a good book on learning how to make tutorials, and which is surprising because it's one of the most important parts of game making. And in the same way that it's hard in theory to separate the interface from the actual software, well, the tutorial and the game should be one, right? I mean, it's not something that you should leave for the end of the production. I mean, if you know what the gameplay is, you should try to integrate it from the very first day, even if the first tutorial sucks. And again, it's such a big part of the game process that that is surprising we haven't paid that much attention to it. It's very hard to do well. It takes a lot of iteration, a lot of trial and error, and a lot of observation with actual players. And that is why a lot of time it just left as an afterthought. This game poses an interesting question, which is, I'm teaching you the algorithm that you need in order to solve equations. And I've heard some math teachers saying, but it doesn't really teach you the essence of equations. These kids are just like monkeys solving equations. They don't really know what they're doing, which I think is unfair in the sense that this is a technology, right? And solving equations is a technology. And it's unfair that you should understand a whole subject right from the beginning. I mean, you might learn how to drive a car without knowing how it works, but the actual fact that you drive might encourage you to love cars and then to get more interested in how the engine works. And this is somehow similar. We also have this sort of holistic, encyclopedic approach to education that we tend to think that students should understand everything and everything at the same time. But here, I mean, it's very effective at giving you a solution to solve equations in the same way that a calculator gives you a solution to quickly solve arithmetic problems. Okay? So I don't think that per se it is a problem. However, it is very effective on algorithmic subjects. By algorithms, I mean recipes. But it's not that effective on some other subjects. And that's, I think, one of the problems, and that's something that I'm going to be talking. There is also a concern that is more ideological than pedagogical, and it's something that Seymour Papert, the inventor of Logo and one of the fathers of constructionism, and one of the very first people to see the computer as a teaching tool for children, which was a totally crazy concept in the 80s and late 70s when he started working. And in The Connected Family, which is a very still quite relevant book, even though it was published in the early 90s, where he discusses the introduction of the internet in schools and in education. He says that he's very troubled by the concept of making education so much fun so kids are not going to notice, as if education was something dirty, as if it was something that we should try to avoid. We should try to fool the student in order to deceive her. And I understand that. I think there's some truth to that, right? I mean, there's an ideological concern there that we should be paying attention. And actually, this is the USA Today quote on Dragon Box, which again I think is a very effective game. But there's so much hate towards math and so much insecurity among parents and children that that this is a very powerful marketing tool. And it's very hard to market a good educational game like this without actually saying this. So it's quite of a challenge in the sense of that you're providing a solution, but you're also perpetrating some sort of ideology that are holding people to see education as something that it's you're being forced upon. And that's the interesting thing. I mean, education and play have always been together genetically. I mean, we evolved as animals. I mean, if you had to create a creature that has to survive on a planet with ever-changing conditions and ever-changing challenges, what would you do? Well, one of the most effective, let's say, coding that evolution found was to associate the zones of play and pleasure and learning. So basically, we learn by exploring, and that gives us pleasure. So naturally, we're inclined to enjoy learning. It's only the school system that kills that millions of years of evolution in a few years. This is another very interesting Canadian project. It's fairly new. It was launched last month. I know the designer, and I think is interesting. It also has some problems, I think, but it's an interesting approach. It's designed for tablets, and one of the most challenging things for school kids is understanding fractions. And there's different games that are trying to deal with this situation. The main character is a mammoth, which is cool. But in addition to that, this is basically cut the rope meets fractions. And the game isn't by any means perfect, but it's very clear on some of the levels. But I want to focus on its problems, because I think we can learn more from its problems. And one of the main problems is that it's a lot of fun. And again, you have played Cut the Rope, I assume, right? I mean, like, it's mandatory in this university. You cannot graduate if you don't complete that game. And this is the thing. I mean, I am a game designer who has been working for 15 years on making games for children. So I'm not an old teacher who hates technology, who's saying, these games are too much fun. Kids should suffer because that's the best way to learn. I'm making this point as a game designer. And I'm saying here that the gameplay in this game is competing against the abstraction of the concept it's supposed to teach. And I think that's one of the most challenging things. Actually, the point of my talk today is not that we should make boring games, but we have to rethink the relationship between challenges and actually gameplay and within educational video games. It's gonna be more clear in a few minutes. So, one of the main problems that serious game designers have, and especially educational game designers have, is that usually, I mean, most of the people who end up making some educational games, most of the time they're also commercial game designers. I mean, these days. It didn't used to be like that, but these days, I mean, there's a lot of people who work on this project and then move on to something else. And we have two main standards of elegance in game design, in commercial game design. One of them is the elegance of trying, for example, to do a great tutorial with very little text, very visual and smart way of approaching the tutorial of the game. And the other measure of success on a game is also immersion. The most immersive the game is, if it has great graphics and great sound and very interesting gameplay, very like a game that is captivating, then we tend to value that as a positive thing. And I think those are the two aspects that, if we really want to crack the concept of making better games that can teach us something useful, those two concepts have to be rethought. I think maybe it sounds crazy, but I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So, immersion in commercial game design is taken for granted, right? and pretty much in a lot of other genres and media, even though it has been criticized. I mean, there is such thing as like non-immersive film or theater. Actually, that was a concept that was worked and experimented by Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright. Basically, he made this very strange point. He basically said that the traditional storytelling based on what Aristotle wrote 25 centuries ago, that a story should have 3 parts, an introduction, a development, and a conclusion. He was making the point that that structure is the most conservative way to maintain the status quo. Of course, he was making his place. He was a communist, and he was making his place in the 20th century among revolutions and big changes. But he made an interesting point. He said that at least he encouraged both the actors, and if you go to his place, usually they try to kill immersion. They try to show, for example, the musicians on stage. They try to put posters. They try to interrupt the action with text. The actor might be saying something, for example, very romantic, and at the same time making movements that are very aggressive. They really wanted to break the fourth wall. They really wanted you to see the strings that are being pulled. Why? Because his goal was for the audience to take distance. Instead of being immersed, he wanted them to be, let's call it, outmersed. Because he said that when you're immersed, you're not critical. When you're immersed, you cannot judge critically what you're seeing. And he said that Aristotelian storytelling and drama keeps you immersed in a way that you've been shown a problem and then it gets solved, and then you go happy back to your place as if nothing had happened. But he says that when something becomes so normal, you take it for granted that you don't see it anymore. And he wanted really to make things explicit. His plays are very interesting, but actually one of his disciples, one of his followers, made actually one of the biggest contributions to game design of the 20th century. And those of you who are taking the workshop with me, we're going to be seeing his work, and we're actually going to get to play some of his games. Augusto Boal. Augusto Boal was a Brazilian playwright, a follower of Brecht, and also a follower of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian teacher and educator who developed the pedagogy of the oppressed, a way of teaching, focusing not on the ruling classes but on the workers, and he was teaching literacy among workers and farmers and people and grown-ups, and he basically introduced the concept that learning is not something that you transfer, but something that you build together. Okay, and interesting. His ideas were also being taken by Seymour Papert, who built Logo and also the One Laptop Per Child project in a very different way, because Papert sort of took those ideas and took it to the digital world. And anyway, Augusto Boal, he really wanted to make a revolutionary theater. In order to do that, he turned it into games. And he actually developed a set of 250 games that he called them theater. I met him and I discussed these ideas with him, and he said, oh, what I do is theater. I said, you have no idea what you're doing. You're actually doing the coolest games for politics and for social change and for philosophy and for psychology. I mean, he invented many techniques. Some of them had been reappropriated. He was actually in exile during the 70s in Sweden. one of the techniques he invented that now is very common because of videotape, but at the moment was never been done before, is what he called invisible theater. And so that actors will perform without telling people in public spaces, and in order to try to pinpoint social problems or social issues. One of the most popular techniques that Boal invented is called the theater of the oppressed. And within the theater of the oppressed, it's called forum theater. And basically, these are very short plays. They're actually simulations. I mean, real-time simulations without a computer. 5-minute plays, plays improvised by the actual audience, so not by professional actors, that agree on a subject they want to explore. And they don't have a third act. Why? Because the third act is always a happy ending or the tragic ending. And Boal said, if you want to learn something about what's going on stage, you have to be able to be open to any outcome. He basically turned theater into a laboratory, a playful laboratory. Let me give you an example. These were leftist artists. So basically, they were working again in workers' unions and with unemployed people, and all those people that leftists like to hang out with for some reason instead of being at the Ritz smoking and drinking fancy cocktails. One of the examples of forum theater, for example, is domestic violence. So he was working with a group of women, and they started discussing what sort of subjects they wanted to discuss, and said, okay, well, domestic violence is a problem here, so let's do something about that. So they would improvise a small play about a woman whose husband would come drunk every night and beat her up. So that's the first act and the development, but they wouldn't decide what was going to happen on the third act. There was no conclusion. So what would happen is that participants will get on the stage and perform this 5-minute play, or 3 minutes sometimes, even shorter. And the thing is that play would be played 12 times, 24 times, because every time it's played, any person, it's a game, any person in the audience can raise their hand and say, stop, and take the role of the main character, and try to improvise in order to break the oppression that's been depicted. And this is interesting because from the outside, and especially with domestic violence, that's something that usually rationally most people say, oh, that would never happen to me. Like people who get battered, they're silly or weak, or that would never happen to me. And so what happens is that most people believe that, so they raise their hand, play the role of the protagonist, and of course everybody else will improvise against them. And for example, let's pretend I think, okay, I'm smart, I can solve this situation. So I play the role of the housewife, and then I see the husband coming. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna screw him, I'm gonna lock the door. I'm waiting by the door, and the guy comes, tries to open the door, he can't. And the protagonist is like, okay, I'm pretty cool, I solved the situation. And then the guy says, because he's improvising, he's like, oh, you won't let me in? Okay, well, I'm gonna move to my lover's house, and because you don't work, you won't have any income and you'll starve. Bye, and goes away. And the idea, I mean, these are problems that don't have a solution, and that's the most important thing. Most games, video games, and stories always move forward a happy ending. Not with reality. I mean, these problems that are analyzed by Boal, they don't have a single solution. If they had had a solution, they would have been solved forever. So people try different things, and the idea is not really to find a solution, but to experiment firsthand how hard and complicated the situation is. In other words, this is a holodeck, this is a simulation, this is like The Sims, but in real life. And it's much different to read about it than to experience it firsthandly. Of course, sometimes somebody can find a solution but most of the time it's a magical thing. So there is a rule that says if you're using like magical devices, you improvise with some like, I don't know, like you find a winning lottery ticket and you move away and that's it. Well, that's not good for forum theater. So what I'm mentioning this because there are already a large set of games that are quite interesting, useful, and have been tested for decades in order to deal with, for example, political and social issues, such as the theater of the oppressed. And their main structure is built against immersion. And I think that's something that we should at least consider for designing educational games. Because what happens? I mean, if I really get immersed on this game experience, if I get intrigued, he's learning algebra, but don't tell him, it's a secret. The student is stupid. I'm not going to tell him he's learning. But what if you interrupt that and you're up front and you treat the student as a human, intelligent human, and said, hey, I mean, this is not really a video game. This is not something that you're doing for leisure. I mean, this is a playful thing, a toy, something that's interesting. But it's also, we're trying to learn this and that, and you're upfront about it. And what would happen if we took that approach in educational video game design? And we tend to think, one of the other dogmas in educational game design is that games are great for learning systems. And why we keep repeating that, and I've been repeating that for decades without actually thinking too much about it, basically because of SimCity, right? And there was a designer who posted on his blog last year, said, well, if games are such great tools for systemic thinking, like this generation should be the most systemic thinking, whatever that means, able in the history of the humankind. And I've been thinking a lot about SimCity. And let me tell you, I mean, not just in game design, educational game design, but in education in general, there is this battle. I mean, the ludology versus narratology is pretty much data versus experience. Okay? So basically, should we teach facts, like what's the capital of Madagascar? Or should we take skills and connect the dots? And of course, it's a false opposition. But the problem is that the traditional school system, in most of the world at least, was inherited from the 19th century, and it was a very data-driven, library-inspired, encyclopedically filled school system. So as a reaction to that, we tend to think, okay, stop teaching kids data. We have to teach them skills, and we have to teach them what to do with the data instead of learning facts, because for facts, there's Google. Okay? And it's actually more complicated than that. I used to argue that, but it's actually more complicated than that. Why? Because critical thinking requires data, and that's a very simple thing to forget when you know the data. What does it mean to be critical about a system? Let's take SimCity, okay? SimCity can teach you a lot of the challenges of being a major and running a city, and it's very good at teaching how, like, a power plant is connected to the school system, because the power plant brings jobs and energy and brings business, so there's more money, so you can fund the school with that money, and also, but it also comes with pollution, and well, so kids should not be right next to it, but if it's too far away from it, then the workers have to spend too much money on transport, and well, all those things that SimCity are great for. Why is it? It's a very interesting thing that we live in a world where video games are being cloned to death. Okay? I mean, the day after Flappy Bird was shut down, there were a gazillion clones already available. There's millions of tower defense games, and not even talk about first-person shooters. Why on earth don't we have more quality clones of two of the best-selling games in the history of mankind, The Sims and Simcity? Why? You would think it would be a great market opportunity, right? I'm not saying they're simple to build, but SimCity, the basics of SimCity, I mean, we're done like 30 years ago. I mean, the code is complex, but it's not that complex. Why is it that? There must be many reasons, but one of the reasons is that it seems like an obvious thing to do. Yeah, we could build a SimCity-like simulator applied to anything else. However, there is something like, imagine that you wanted to do a SimCity simulator to teach chemistry, about how molecules interact, or about the human body, how organs interact. In theory, it sounds easy. When you build it, it's a recipe for disaster. Why? Because players, even young kids, know the data behind the objects in SimCity. By that, I mean that they have a pretty good concept of what a school is, what a power plant is, what a road is. But not necessarily when you transport that to other systems. You cannot build an effective simulator of chemistry if you don't first know the molecules. Before knowing how they interact by each other, you have to know their names and properties. Same thing for the organs. And that's why we tend to oversee the importance of facts, because we learn those. We learned those since we were kids. I mean, the amount of information and data we've been gathering since we were born is huge, okay? So game designers like, oh, I'll focus on the design, on the gameplay. Forget about the data, and especially because games are not very good at delivering data. Books are, and videos are, but not games. So we tend to have this confrontation between these two different genres. Okay, is it possible to put them together? Well, as we saw on that first slide when I showed the instructions, video games and a lot of text don't go well together. Okay, a lot of data and actions usually don't go well together. However, both are essential as teaching tools. And of course, you don't have to use them at the same time. You could like read a book, then play a game, and they can complement each other. Still, most educational game designers try to make the game more bookish rather than turn the books more playable. And that's something that I think is one of the most interesting things that's happening right now. I'm going to show you we'll get to this later. I'm going to show you, this is a prototype from Chaim Gingel's PhD thesis, which I think is one of the, and I'm not exaggerating, promising and relevant pieces of software right now in the whole world. Who is Chaim Gingel? Chaim Gingel, he's right now a student at University of California, Santa Cruz. He's been working with Michael Matthias, who's created Facade among other things. But he used to be working very, very closely with Will Wright. And Chaim is very good at prototyping systems, very good at creating simulators, not only coding them, but also conceiving them. He was born with that superpower. And his resume is one of the most impressive pieces of design. He was the senior game designer for Sport's Creature Creator, which is the only magnificent part of Sport, because Sport didn't work that well, right? But the Creature Creator is such an amazing tool that allows you to put together these monsters in such an elegant and effective way. And that tool took a gazillion of iterations, and Chaim was in charge of that. And for his PhD project, he decided to do something crazy. He decided to go the other way. He decided to make books playable. And that sounds, again, like the less sexy decision you could make as a designer, right? I mean, like, why would you do that? If you're a genius, why you would do that? Books are like so 20th century or whatever. And So the basic concept is that I'm going to do a book, a textbook, that is not illustrated by images or by graphs or by pictures or by videos or multimedia stuff. It's going to be illustrated by simulation. And by simulations, he means toys. Okay? I'm going to show you, it's a book about geology. So he actually picked a very smart subject because, as I was saying, he has to teach a lot of concepts on about geology because it's not actually a subject that is taught in most of the formal schools around the world, unlike some other subjects. But it's very concrete, and all the elements interact in very elegant ways. Let me actually show you how it works. Again, this is an advanced prototype, but it may crash. And so it's a textbook that sometimes includes some images with very little text. But the problem is not with the text. Each section of the book teaches a different concept of geology. And you see that image there of the desert, but each one of those are playable. And in most of the pages, you have a mission. So in this particular one, you can create wind and see how wind will interact with sand in order to create dunes. So you won't be able to see my finger in there, but I'm going to, oops. Create some wind. Okay? And that's what I created. Every single example, there's a little, here, a little menu that you can unlock. And let's make it rain. See what happens. So I make it rain here. But it's too hot, so the water will evaporate. So let's change the temperature. And now I can make it snow there, but it's too cold. You don't want to create Finland in the desert, so let's try for something in between. And you get the idea. You can create mountains. Let's go to a different simulation. This is how vegetation interacts with dunes. Okay, and the challenge you have in this page is to make small sand piles on the map near the shore and further inland and see what happens. So I'm going to create a little thing in there, a big dune. And suddenly the vegetation changed on one of the parts of the map. The whole book is like that. The whole book focuses on many different concepts, and each concept has this tiny simulator. However, it's very goal-oriented at first. And once you learn each one of the concepts, then it becomes SimCity. So it basically starts as mission-oriented games, and then it becomes literally, in this case, sandbox play. Okay? And why? Because if it gives you a sandbox, even though we're familiar with mountains and humidity and water, I mean, some of the concepts are, I didn't even know that. I mean, I've been on this planet for 41 years, and my experience in geology is not that great. So I learned a lot through this. And I think it's such a small twist on the concept of ebooks and interactive books. But of course, it's so expensive. You have to be a genius pretty much to code 200 little sims like this in an effective and clear way. And he's been having, I mean, he learned from Will Wright, so I mean, he learned literally from the best. I'm saying that this it might be hard to replicate on a scale. But as a prototype, it could definitely be a harbinger of what's coming next. And I've been having long talks with Chaim, and I've seen how his project evolved. In order to finish the talk, I wanted to, basically, I just started a new project. I just got a grant. I simply wanted to describe it to you because it sort of follows a little bit of this philosophy. It's like, I don't want to create something, I want to create something that's playful, but that is not a game. And I think that's the challenge that educational game designers are facing. I mean, it's okay if it's not a game. It's okay if it's interrupted by data, as long as you're upfront with the player and said, this is a learning experience. You're at school. This is not the new commercial game, and it's okay. We shouldn't be afraid of treating students as intelligent people. We should not try to fool them into, okay, get lost in this experience and you will learn without noticing, okay? And so this is what I'm working on. I literally don't have any, I started working on the prototype, which by the way, I'm doing in Construct 2, and I'm really surprised at how well the HTML5 performs. Again, a couple of years ago, HTML5 was pure crap, and now it works, which is like a miracle. But anyway, I don't get paid by the people who build Construct 2 to make advertising, but this is serious appreciation of this. And this is also sort of a book. I'm just showing two different sketches. And it will teach you to deal with equations and graphs by building skateboard platforms. And the experience begins with this little robot and a remote control, and you will have these numbers on the floor, and you have this remote control that has a rule for this robot to work, to behave. And this is the robot that puts the nails on the wall in order to build the skateboards. So the robot has an extensive arm, like Inspector Gadget, and the height of the arm will depend on the amount of steps that he walks. So in this case, it's by 2. So if the robot gets like here, those are 3 steps, so you replace here with 3, and the arm will go up 6. I will put a little nail on it. And then, for example, 6 will go up to 12 and put another nail to it. And as you advance, then you build a ramp, and then skaters will fall through the ramp, and there'll be different little coins you have to collect. And of course, as you advance, this will get replaced by a Y and this by an X, but it's basically teaching how to graph equations. Not really by, it's going to be upfront about what the goal about this is, but the experience of the equation is going to be by controlling remotely this little robot. And my objective was to teach it on a more intuitive way, because later you'll be able to add +5, for example, and then the graph will be able to go up and down, or you'll be able to turn it on different angles, and then you have different quadrants, and you'll be able to build more complex skateboards. And then, of course, there'll be quadratic equations with different shapes. And again, but it's never going to hide that this is a math teaching tool, even though it has some interesting devices like this robot or the boards that you can play with. And again, my goal in this talk was basically to introduce a question. And that question is that maybe, just maybe, and some of the examples I've seen around, especially this project by Gingold, might tell us that there is an alternative way to make effective challenging and interesting educational games. And that's not just by copying and following the standards of elegance in tutorials and in immersion from commercial games. There may be an alternative way, and we have a lot to learn from non-immersive offline games, such as the ones developed by Boal. So that's basically the question I wanted to raise, and that's about it. So I'm ready to answer questions. I don't have any answers, but if you have questions, I can fake the answers. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, this fancy microphone.
A device. Wow.
Any thoughts? All right, here comes.
Sorry. Do you think there might be, or do you have any perhaps preliminary thoughts on, do you think there are different needs for different subjects?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. So like we saw, there was a lot of, or most of the examples had lots of graphical finesse when teaching math, and especially when teaching, the graph game you were making obviously had a lot of graphs and pictures for that, whereas the geology used text and especially simulation. So do you obviously see that there are different needs for different subjects?
I mean, I've been talking about education in general, which is like talking about like literature in general. I mean, and it's a very valid point, because if you generalize, it's hard sometimes to focus on actual solutions. Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, definitely yes. And I think there's a lot of social pressure, specifically on mathematics, because of how challenging it is to younger students, and how much social pressure there is for them to learn, and it's a recipe for disaster. So, but one of the cool things, for example, from the Boal games is that they apply to sociology, they apply to politics. There's also, it could be applied to literature or to poetry. If you can also simulate word games. But even the graphs and even the equation game, the Dragon Box, I mean, they're still playful and simulate T. I mean, some of them are more goal-oriented, some of them are more open-ended. But at the end of the day, the idea is that you'll be able to tweak, you'll be able to play. And let me go back to here. This is one of the most important, I think, things that we should think about when we think about traditional schoolings, is that there's so much ideology in school systems, and we tend to think that a high school should have a laboratory because that's where we learn science, and that's where kids will get inspired to become scientists. And laboratories are nothing but parodies of science. I mean, 99.9% of the times that you go into a lab, and I don't want to make fun of teachers, I mean, they're really trying to help, but most of the time, they're not teaching science. They're trying to replicate an experiment. It's game-oriented. It's not play. I mean, actual science, you don't know what you're going to find out. You don't know the answer beforehand. 99.9% of the times in high schools, in laboratories, you're trying to replicate a reaction, and you're trying to get it right. There's no such thing in science, because you don't know what's going to happen. So I'm not saying that's not important, but that's not simulation. That's not experimentation. That's something else. Okay. A playful attitude towards learning means, just like in SimCity, just like in there, you do not, just like in Boal's theater, you do not know the outcome. And if we want a generation that learns how to deal with that, and it's very messed up, because like, you don't know the outcome, you don't know what grade you're gonna get, you don't know what's gonna happen, you don't know if it's gonna suck. So, but we tend to fool ourselves saying that we're teaching science, and we're not. And I think simulations have the potential to do that, and to do unexpected stuff, and see what happens, and take risks, and make mistakes, and learn from those mistakes. But anyway, to shortly answer your question again, definitely. I mean, there's so many subjects and so different requirements on each one of them. But overall, I think goal-oriented games, open simulations, and tutorials combined with information, I think those are the ingredients that we have to mix in order to explore new ways of teaching with games. Oh yes, throw it to me and I'll throw it to her. Come on, let's play a game.
This is a bad poster to try to make you get
I didn't get to play.
I can throw this.
There you go. Okay.
I got it. Yeah, I kind of, this is a specific question about that naming that you mentioned, that if there is kind of difficult new names of something, it might be harmful for the gameplay. Or a challenge at least. And this is kind of, I'm working with the group here as on a project about a game about cancer. And it's played with the cancer cells and the mutations of the cells. And the names of the mutations are quite complicated, like Lichen projectiles or cell cycle mutagenes and this kind of stuff. And of course, like this Lichen projectile is a gun. And it a bit looks like a gun, and it can be used like a gun, but still I'm kind of been worried that how this, like, is there good examples that you can make a game, and this is not like exactly serious game.
That's okay. Well, a game about cancer, it doesn't get more serious than that.
Yeah, the subject is serious, but the gameplay, it's not educative in that way, that we have been following the certain ways that we have learned that cancer works. So the examples are from real life, but it's totally simplified and maybe not so educative, I don't know. But I was just... Well,
being educative doesn't mean that you have to remember tons of names, by the way. But
yeah, but anyway, I'm kind of, because there have been like two sides of it. Like, I'm afraid, personally, that this, because they cause me headache, these horrible names that those cells have, but some other guys are thinking that it doesn't matter, that like it's a strategy game, and in strategy games happening in fantasy worlds, the names can be anything.
Who is the target audience?
What?
Who is the target audience, the players?
I don't know if we have like really kind of decided yet, but young. It's a strategy game, but the subject is a bit. But yeah, it's a long while if I start to think now who is exactly the audience.
Okay,
because
but you have to think about that, because
yes,
it's hard to make a game with you don't know who's going to play it. But
yeah.
Anyway, to answer your question about I was being more. I was using the naming in a more metaphorical way, but it's important to think on what you want to teach, and that's something that us teachers, most of the time, can easily lose the focus, and you see this in traditional school systems all over the world again and again and again and again, and it's like you want to teach about, I don't know, ecology, and you get kids to build these interactive models with like windmills and trees and stuff, and they end up spending 95% of the time dealing with glue and developing fine motor skills, but not really thinking about ecology. And that's the problem also with education, is that any activity that you do could be framed as educational. Even if it's the worst class ever, at the end, the school administrator is going to say, well, they learn how to sit quietly and behave. that's something that's going to be useful for their future life. So you have to know exactly beforehand what is exactly that you want to convey. If the names are important, focus on that and try to explain how they're built. I mean, those names usually have a structure behind them, and make a game in order to teach that. If they're not that important and what you want to teach is some relationships between concepts, focus on that. But it's something that, because it's very easy to, not just school administrators, but even designers, we can be easily being self-deceived that way. I said, well, I didn't manage to do this, but at least they know that they have to try not to get cancer. Okay, achievement unlocked. Now, what I'm trying to say is that look at the game, but also look at the subject and agree on, make a list of 5 different areas and change the order and say, this is the main thing I want to communicate, this is the second, this is the third. And then if the names are in the list, focus on them. If not, focus on something else. Okay, that would be my advice. But we can work on, I mean, you can show it to me and we can work on during the week on that. Hey.
Hi. Okay. You talk about this learning should be fun, and
I'm not sure if fun is the word.
Yeah,
I mean challenging should be,
yeah,
and difficult. But
yeah,
challenging means difficult in a nice way.
yeah. But I have been thinking, because one aspect in the education is to teach children or any human being that learning is also like getting out of your comfort zone, like doing difficult things, and how to teach the skills to teach yourself something, to learn something.
Okay.
So how do you feel about these serious games and teaching this thing?
If I get you right, I mean what you're saying is about like meta skills, how kids develop the idea of learning to learn.
Yeah.
Okay, that's definitely should be one of the biggest goals of current educational systems. In my country, I'm amazed. I mean, every single kid has internet access and a computer, and then I work with them when they're teenagers, and then they don't Google very well at all. They don't really know they're not very sophisticated on how to get information. And why? Because we keep teaching them 19th century poetry, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but they have this huge library of information. They don't know how to open the door and they don't know how to navigate it. So can it be taught through games? Definitely. Like one of the workshops we were planning to do specifically to teach this is a treasure hunt on the internet. Okay, so you make a game and you said, okay, you have to find all these pieces of information through different pages and Google, and you have to do it in 5 Googles. Like you only have 5 chances to Google in order to get to this piece of information. And so you can definitely make games in order to encourage that. And it's not something that you have to do it once. You have to constantly do it. I mean, and I think it's even more important than teaching data. Again, teaching data is more important than what we think. But teaching how to get to it, how to discover it, how to analyze it, and how to see if it's relevant. It's something that should happen like every day in school. So can it be done through games? Yes, definitely. Do I know many effective games? Well, that's the other thing. I mean, in this early 21st century, we have these app Googles that can be useful, but also are very limiting. In the sense that I was having this talk with an English teacher a few months ago, and she was like, "Oh, you know a lot about technology. Is there any app that's good for teaching English?" And I said, "No, but you have the internet that it's written 60% of it is in English, and it's a great tool." Yeah, but I want an app, because the app will be the same for everybody, so I only have to learn one. I said, "No, but your students, one of them was going to love cars, the other boats, the other sports, the other horses, and everything is in there. Yeah, but that's hard to handle. So that's the other thing. I mean, we don't just have to think in terms of software and thinking of learning in a box or in books or in contained experiences. We also have, in the same way that you have these trips to the woods in order to learn, well, the internet is a pretty wild wood, and there's a lot of games you can do in there, just not capsulated inside an app that you can buy for 99 cents. Okay? Okay. Are there any other questions about how greatly Uruguay is going to perform in the Soccer World Cup? I'd be happy to answer that. Finland is not playing, so if you support our team, we'll get you a lot of beef. If you're vegetarians, we're sorry, but we're like meat eaters. It's bad karma, but that's what we do. Anyway, I really appreciate your time today. I hope, I don't know, I messed with your heads a little bit about these concepts. Many of you are taking this week-long workshop with me, and we're going to be working together. I'm really excited about this. I have been here. I didn't write my email, but I'm going to do that right now. And so you can contact me if you have any questions. By the way, Frasca is my last name, and Ort is the university that I teach in Uruguay, and we have one of the... Oh, hold on. Well, the construct is not great, but Frasca, F-R-A-S-C-A, at Ort UI, and we have one of the very first undergrad programs in game design in South America, which is something quite interesting because I never thought I was going to be to see that happen, and it happened like that. So the world changes, and that's a good thing. Well, again, thank you so much, and I'm going to be here all week, so if you have any questions, I'll be happy to talk to you. Otherwise, by email. I never reply my emails, but you should feel free to ask me as many questions as you want. Thank you so much. Thank you.